It's my pleasure to welcome everyone who's attending or watching the live stream of tonight's presentation on the IB diploma from the perspective of universities. Here at UCC, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of our designation as an IB World School. We're proud of our IB program and how it connects our students to the world around them. It's a robust, well-rounded program that provides them with a bigger purpose and vision while instilling critical thinking skills. We view it as a gold standard in education, internationally benchmarked and recognized. Our alumni agree. In a recent survey, 94% of our alumni said they valued their IB diploma, with 79% of them saying they strongly valued the IB. But that's our point of view and theirs. What are universities saying about the IB? Do they value and recognize the IB diploma as much as we do here at IB schools? Tonight, to offer that perspective, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Andrew Arida. Andrew is currently the Associate Registrar and Director of Student Recruitment and Undergraduate Admissions at the University of British Columbia. Andrew joined UBC in 1996 and has worked in prospective student recruitment, undergraduate admissions, and enrollment management. He holds a BA in Psychology from the University of Calgary and an MA in Higher Education from UBC. His research focused on the effects of different admission criteria, including broad-based admissions and using personal characteristics of applicants on shaping a first-year class. Andrew sits on the International Baccalaureate College and University Recognition Committee and has shared UBC's research on the IB diploma with audiences in North America, Asia, and Europe. Andrew is also currently president of ARUCC, the Association of Registrars of the Universities and Colleges of Canada, and sits on the Admissions Committee for the BC Council on Admissions and Transfer. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Arida.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is certainly my pleasure to be here tonight and to share some information with you about the IB and the effects that it has on a student's education. Before I get going, I did want to offer a few thanks. I want to particularly thank the IB Schools Association of Ontario for putting together and promoting this event. When we contacted them a few weeks back and said we're in the area and we'd be happy to come and share some information, they leapt on it with an enthusiasm and a quest for, a thirst for information that is typically IB. So we're very happy that IBSO invited us in, and also a big thanks to Upper Canada College for hosting us in this beautiful venue. I'll give you a quick rundown of what it is that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Really what we want to do is to share some information about how the IB diploma predicts and supports success in university. What I'm going to do is spend about maybe 50 to 60 minutes running you through this content. I will give you a little introduction to the IB in case there are some people here who aren't familiar with the diploma program. A little background on UBC. Talk a little bit about why we value the IB and some of the positive results that we've seen at the University of British Columbia. Share with you a little bit about how we make undergraduate admission decisions for IB students, and then go to a Q&A at the end. Couple of covering comments. If you want to make any notes tonight, no need. There's only one note that you need to make. I've posted my email address on this slide. If you'd like a copy of this slide deck, feel free to send me an email and I will send you the whole slide deck. Throughout this slide deck, you're going to see that there's a number of links to studies that talk about IB student performance. I'll send it to you. It'll contain all the hot links so that you can get all the background research that's referenced in the presentation. So please feel free to email me if you'd like a copy. I will also say that in the spirit of IB, we want this event to be informative and an opportunity for you to engage in dialogue and to ask questions. There will be a Q&A at the end, but there will also be opportunity, if you have a question that you want to ask throughout the presentation, please do so. To encourage audience participation, we have these lovely little UBC chocolates. And my colleagues who are located throughout the room ask a question and they will give you a chocolate. So there is an incentive. And lastly, before I start, one thing I want you to know about what this presentation is not. This presentation is not an overview of UBC or its programs or the way admission requirements and all those kinds of things. We've structured this presentation to be more about sharing research on how IB students perform and not about how to get into UBC and what kinds of things you can study at UBC. If you are interested in that kind of information, we're running an event in a few days' time down at the Convention Center where we're going to talk about our programs and admission requirements and all the things that a student needs to prepare for admission to UBC. This is going to be more about general information on the IB diploma and what we've seen as the results of performance for IB students. I did want to, before I begin, also identify I've got a number of colleagues from IB who are in the room. Could I just ask them to put up their hands, please? I can't see. Okay, they are here, and at the end of the presentation, they can also answer questions as well about UBC and anything specific that you might want to know about our university. But getting back to IB. How did this presentation come about? About a month or so ago, I got an email from one of the local IB coordinators who I know in Vancouver. And this is what he wrote me via email. He said, Andrew, it's that time of year where grade 12 IB students begin to question the validity of the IB program and the amount of work that they have to do. It's always a tough question to answer because while the aim of the IB program isn't just about university admissions, it's certainly a big part. And there's quite naturally a sense of fear that students would do better in the regular program where they would undoubtedly achieve better marks. This summer we had an extraordinary number of students drop out of the program despite my futile efforts to convince them to stay. My arguments of better preparation sound hollow when many of them worry that they won't even make it into university. So, the question is, are you better off with the regular high school diploma with a high grade or a mediocre IB score? In other words, is a university like UBC more likely to give an offer to an IB student than to a regular student? As the years go by, I get these questions all the time, but as the years go by, they seem to become more and more frequent. And more times than not, there's a lot of concern out there about the IB diploma. When students sit with their counselors or with their parents, the question is always, should I go into the IB or should I stay in the regular high school program? I hear the IB diploma is very difficult. Will doing the IB hurt my chances of getting into university? And why should I do the IB diploma? This presentation is an attempt to try and answer some of those questions. And one of the overarching themes of tonight's presentation is the following. Students should think less about getting into university and more about doing well once they get into university. I know that sometimes there's a real worry about there's a particular school I want to get into. I've heard it's hard to get in. I've heard you need really high grades to get in. All those things may be true, but it really is important that students focus on doing well in university more so than getting in. Many of us in the room who have university degrees and many students who are in university right now will tell you it's better to do well in university and succeed and get good grades in university. That is more important than getting into your dream school. And so some of the things I want to talk about tonight are about the importance of doing well in university as opposed to just getting in. We're very lucky to live in a country where there's a lot of access to universities, a lot of access to very high quality universities. And as a result, again, focus more on doing well than necessarily where you get in. I wrote back to that IB coordinator from that email, and I shared with him some thoughts. We got into a good conversation back and forth, and as a result of some of that information, we've come up with this presentation that you're going to see tonight. It was born out of that conversation. We thought that we'd like to share it with some of the IB communities, and so here we are. A little background on the IB, just in case there are some folks here who are not familiar with the IB diploma. So, the International Baccalaureate Diploma wait a second. The International Baccalaureate Diploma has its roots in Europe. Post-World War II, the children of many expatriates who lived in Europe, they wanted to create a credential that would be recognized around the world. And would allow students who were studying in Europe, again, born in Geneva and Switzerland through the UN, students to have the opportunity to travel all over the world for their post-secondary education. Through the support of the International Students School Association, founded in Europe, the International School of Geneva pioneered the IB curriculum in 1968. Since then, the IB has grown dramatically. It started off as just a high school diploma program. It in later years added a middle school program, a primary years program. It added second languages. You can do the IB diploma in English or in Spanish or in French. As of May 2015, there are 2,795 IB schools around the world offering the diploma in 143 different countries. It's also important to note that about half of those schools are independent schools and half of those schools are public or state schools. So the IB lives quite comfortably in both public and independent schools. This is sort of a graphic representation of what the IB curriculum in the diploma is all about. Although the IB started as something that was about helping students get into universities all over the world, it wasn't just seen as a credential, it was seen as a different pedagogy and a different way of teaching. I've got a quote here from Howard Gardner, who is a professor of educational psychology at Harvard, who described the IB as less parochial than most American efforts. And it helps students think critically, synthesize knowledge, reflect on their own thought processes, and get their feet wet in interdisciplinary thinking. And this is evidenced in the way the IB diploma is constructed. So I'll give you a quick overview of what the diploma looks like in terms of its construction, because this information is important in terms of understanding how we make admission decisions. The IB diploma usually includes 6 courses, some at the higher level and some at the standard level. Those courses include courses that look at the arts, sciences, mathematics, individuals and societies, language acquisition, and studies in literature and language. IB students will usually all pick up a second language as part of their IB diploma, and in some cases the students can opt out of the arts course and replace it with another science if they so choose. But all IB diploma students will do 6 courses, usually 3 at the higher level and 3 at the standard level. And higher level and standard levels are just indications of the amount of hours that students have spent in each course. So if I took English at the higher level, I would spend 240 teaching hours in that course. If someone else took English at the standard level, they would have 150 teaching hours in that course over a span of 2 years. So higher level and standard just speak to the amount of work in the course, the amount of content. There's also something called the core, and you see this in the center of the diagram. The core includes 3 components. One is theory of knowledge. This is an epistemological course that teaches students to think about how they learn. The second is something called the extended essay. This is a long-form graduating thesis that IB students have to do as part of their IB diploma. And creativity, action, and service, which is a component that involves community hours, volunteer work, and contributing something back to the community around them. Those 3 pieces in the core, added to the 6 courses, make up the whole IB diploma. Each course is scored on a scale of 0 to 7. And you get 3 additional points for the course. So 6 courses, 7 points each, that's 42, plus 3 means the maximum IB score is 45. In terms of when grades become available, grades are issued in anywhere from December to March, where IB diploma schools will predict the final grades. And that's what most universities use to make admission decisions. I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. But the main thing to know is that grades are issued at 2 points, one in December to March for the purposes of university admission, and then final grades happen in July. This is the 2014 distribution of all the grades presented by IB students. And you can see a couple of things here. The blue section is where the students got diplomas. The yellow section is where the diploma was not awarded, and the red just sort of fills in the gap so that you can see the total number of diplomas. So a couple of things to point out here. First, you'll see that the average global score on an IB diploma is probably somewhere in the range of about 31 points. Secondly, it's really important to realize that this distribution is not the same thing as a high school distribution of grades. If you were to look at the high school grades in Ontario or in British Columbia or anywhere in Canada, you would see a lot of students who are getting grades in the highest reaches of the grading scale. 98s, 97s, 96s. But as you can see at the highest point of the IB diploma, there's very, very few students. Less than 1% globally get a perfect score of 45. So high grades in the IB are not as common as high grades in the regular high school program. And that's something we as universities have to contend with and figure out in order to make fair admission decisions. Just to give you a context, at UBC, the mean entering grade of an IB student would be around 32. So our intake is more or less representative of the average IB grades that we see from students around the world. Where are students doing the IB? The majority of IB lives in North America. You'll see the United States is the biggest source of IB diplomas, Canada second. I will point out one thing though, while the United States has quite a few more students doing the IB than in Canada, the proportion of full diploma students is much higher in Canada than it is in the United States. In the United States, a lot of students tend to take an IB course or 2, an AP course or 2, an honors course or 2, and they graduate with their US high school diploma. In most cases, IB students in Canada, if they're in the diploma program, are obtaining the full diploma. And as you can see, Canada is much higher than UK, which is the number 3. So the point here is that the diploma is a very common and prevalent thing in Canada, more so than almost anywhere else in the world. Where do IB students go? It's hard to see on this slide from the back, but I'll hit the high points for you. This is a representation of universities that receive the most IB transcripts. So where do IB students go? The number 1 and number 2 destinations in the world of IB students are right here in Canada. The University of Toronto is number 1, and pulling behind a mere 47 students behind the U of T is the University of British Columbia. I know in preparation for this presentation we sent out material saying we were the number 1 destination. UBC is the number 1 destination. 2 weeks ago I got updated information from the IB. We've slipped to number 2, but we're still up there. A couple of things to point out. You will notice that the IB destinations in North America tend to go to the large flagship research institutions. You may wonder, where are some of the more elite, in many cases, Ivy League schools? How come they're not here? Do IB students not go to those schools? Absolutely they do. This is about numbers. Those schools tend to have smaller first-year classes. The schools that you see listed here tend to have much larger first-year classes, so we take in more IB students. I'll talk about that more in a second. Secondly, it's important to realize that in a lot of cases, how many IB students go to a university is representative of the number of IB schools in that area. So you have places like Florida, where they have gone to great lengths to put an IB school in all the different school districts so that all students in Florida, this is the decision at the state level, will have access to the IB. So obviously you see a lot of Florida universities coming up into the top 25. So this is a representation of where students go, but it's also a representation of where IB schools exist. I mentioned before that you don't see as many Ivy Leagues here because their numbers are smaller. There's a lot of research on how IB students perform and how they get into universities that conclude that IB students do get into the most selective schools in the world. So this was a study that was done by an organization in the UK that compared a comparable group of A-level students in the UK, the A-levels being the credentials that are offered in the UK, and compared them with a comparable group of IB students. And they found that the IB students were more likely to attend a more selective top 20 university than their counterparts in the A-level program. This information is also seen in North America. This was a study that was done by the University of Chicago, where they looked at IB students in the public schools, and they found that a much higher proportion of the IB students compared to a comparable group of high school graduates attended a more selective university. Now, a couple of things to be cautious of here. In the case of the University of Chicago study, they were specifically looking at a lot of students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And as you can imagine, a student from a lower socioeconomic background who does the IB is probably a bit more focused on their education and therefore more likely to go to a more selective post-secondary institution. But even once you control for these kinds of things, we can conclude that IB students do get into some of the most selective schools in the world. Again, if you get a copy of my slide deck, you'll see there's little links in the corner. You can download the full reports from which I've pulled this information. So that's a little bit about the IB. Let me tell you a little bit about UBC to put our perspective into context. UBC is a four-year public research intensive university. We're consistently ranked in the top 40 in the world in university rankings, top 25 in terms of public schools. About 30% of our incoming class comes from around the world. So we're a very international school, lots of students who come from across Canada. We're a competitive institution. Last year on the Vancouver campus, the mean entering average of a student was 90%. On the Okanagan campus, it was 84%. So we're a selective institution, a large school, particularly the Vancouver campus, similar to what you might be familiar here with the University of Toronto. We do have two campuses. This is the Vancouver campus, our larger campus, about 48,000 students all told, and we have a smaller campus in Kelowna in the Okanagan. The Okanagan campus is a particularly diverse student body. 2/3 of the first-year class at the UBCO campus come from outside of the local area. So that's a first-year class pulling in students from all over the country and all over the world, making for a very diverse environment in a slightly smaller learning environment than what you'd find at the Vancouver campus. Some information about us and the IB. We admit students based entirely on two things, if they're an IB student, obviously. Their anticipated IB diploma grades and a personal profile. We don't look at regular high school courses if you're an IB student. And many universities in Canada do things the same way. We ask schools, such as Upper Canada College or any IB World School, to send us a form called a predicted or anticipated IB grades. These are the grades that the school anticipates that the student will have. They give us this information in, like I said, January to February. They send it to us, and that's what we use to make the academic portion of the admission decision. And most universities in Canada are the same. There's a form online. You can Google it. UBC IB anticipated grades form, and you can see the document that schools send us. The U of T has a very similar form. UWO has a very similar form. Calgary, Alberta, Simon Fraser, Victoria, all have very similar forms that you can see online. The IB school fills it out with the anticipated grades. That's what we use to make the academic portion of the decision. Of course, at UBC, we also look at a personal profile. We ask students to answer 5 to 7 short answer questions. Their personal profile mixed with their IB diploma together is how we make the admission decision. We have the second highest number of IB transcripts in the world. We have just under 15% of our direct entry class come to us with an IB background. 90% of that group have a full IB diploma. So there's a lot of IB in our first year class. We have a program actually at UBC in our education program specifically to educate students to become IB teachers. And we're one of the few universities in Canada that offer something along those lines. So it's not just a great place to go as an IB student, it's a great place to go if you want to become an IB teacher. The research that I'm about to show you, how did it come about? It came about for both principled and practical reasons. Practically, about 10 years ago, our faculty asked the admissions office to begin to do research to understand how IB anticipated grades predict how students perform on their final IB grades and in first year university. So our faculty asked us to do this. We began to work with some of the local IB schools to get a sense of how do they predict grades. When they fill out those forms I was telling you about, how do they predict that this student's going to get a 6 on their IB biology? Or how is this student going to get a 7 on their IB math? So we began to work with the local schools to try and understand how they do their predictions, because we were concerned that there may not be as much accuracy as we would like in how the schools did their predictions. We worked with the schools, we gave them feedback, and we began to come to a common understanding of how IB measures students' performance. That's the practical reason that we did all the research that I'm about to show you. But there was a principled reason as well. Our Senate at UBC has mandated a policy to the undergraduate admissions office. And the policy states that applicants will not be disadvantaged by the structure, which means the timing, the sequencing, the grading scheme of the educational followed that provides the basis of admission. In other words, our university asked our office to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged in the admission decision because of the curriculum that they present. Now, many years ago, this wasn't a big deal because most of our applicants presented the same curriculum. In 1996, when I started at UBC, this is a graphic representation of our applicant pool. The red are students who applied from Canada, and the blue are students who applied from around the world. This past year, this is what the pool looked like. We have a lot more students presenting credentials from all over the world. IB, British patterned, Hong Kong, US high school diplomas, French baccalaureates, German arbiters. We have all these different curricula that we receive, and we have to make sure that nobody gets disadvantaged because their scale is on a scale of 0 to 20. Or in their system, an A is 80% as opposed to 86% in another system. So this forced us to begin to research to make sure we understood the curricula that are being presented to us and that we are treating people fairly. The question is, if I've got one seat left in a program, and I've got to fill that seat, and I've got an IB student with a predicted 29, a BC or Ontario high school student with a 91, and a British student with 2 A's and a B on their A levels, which student do I choose? The idea here is to try and determine, of those 3 students, who is the most likely to succeed in university. So to put it into a very practical context, this is the first day of class on the Vancouver campus. We have a huge event, a rally to welcome the students to campus. And as I look at this group of students who are starting their first year at UBC, the question that comes to me is this: is the weakest student we admitted still more likely to succeed than the strongest student that we turned away, who isn't in this picture? That's what drove the research on trying to understand the IB. So, let's get to that research. Why IB? Why are we so focused on the IB? Well, there's a number of different reasons. The first is that there's a very strong presence in our local school system in British Columbia. Some of the biggest IB schools are a 15-minute drive away from the Vancouver campus. We've had IB for quite some time in both the public and the private schools, so it sort of behooves us to make sure we understand what this curriculum is all about. We like the IB because there's a lot of diversity. Lots of different countries around the world have the IB diploma, so it contributes to a very well-rounded class. It is a straightforward and reliable way of making admission decisions. In other words, when we're trying to make admission decisions, we are trying to guess human behavior. We're trying to use bits of data, bits of information to guess human behavior. And the behavior of 17-year-olds, which makes it doubly hard to predict. So we need reliable information to make admission decisions with. So let me explain to you what some of these numbers mean, in case they're, for the statisticians in the room, it'll be really easy, but for everybody else, let me explain a little bit about what these numbers mean. What we're doing here is we are comparing the reliability of different kinds of grades in relation with the first year average of a student at UBC. The number that you see, the R squared, is basically, it's the variance. The higher that number, the more reliable the predictor the grade is of how the student will do in university. And one thing to bear in mind, final grades are always better predictors than early grades. So I don't care if you're an Ontario high school student, an IB student, a US high school student from anywhere, your grades in July are always better predictors than your grades in January, February, or March. So what do we get from this slide? For North American IB students, the predictive ability of the early grades is 0.29. The predictive ability of the final grades is 0.44. 44% of all the variation that we see in first-year UBC sessional averages can be explained by the IB students' final grades. From a social science perspective, that is super strong. If you compare it to the final grades of an Ontario high school diploma, an Alberta high school diploma, or a BC high school diploma, you'll see that the final grades on the IB diploma are much higher. And in fact, the anticipated grades, the early grades from the IB diploma, are just as strong as the final grades from the regular high school stream. Put it into comparison, there was a study that was done in California where they looked at high school grades, SATs, SAT2s, and parental background and socioeconomic status. That combination of predictors led to an R squared of 0.25, lower than the anticipated IB grades and the final IB grades. All the research tells us that the best predictor of success in university are high school grades. Yes, personal profiles, extracurricular information can help make for a stronger decision. But if I had to pick one thing and one thing only with which to make admission decisions, I would use high school grades. And IB high school grades are more reliable than just about any other set of high school grades that will come across our desks in the admissions office. There's lots of information that talks about, lots of different studies that talked about how IB students do in university. There are studies from the UK, from the United States, that look at the fact that IB students have higher graduation rates. They're more likely to enroll in more prestigious institutions. They're more likely to continue on to further studies, more likely to be, go on to graduate positions. There's lots of information out there from a variety of different studies that talk about the fact that IB students do well. And in our case for UBC, we'll see that on average, the typical IB student has a first-year sessional average that is higher than a non-IB student. Now, one very big caution with these conclusions and the majority of these studies, there is a huge chicken and egg factor here that needs to be considered. Do IB students do better because the IB makes them better, or are better students attracted to the IB? That's a very difficult question to answer. But for whichever of those two reasons, we know that if you're coming out with the IB diploma, odds are you're going to do well in university. IB students are more engaged. They are more likely to not just do well in university and persist, but they're also more likely to get the most out of their their university education. So there are studies from the University of Chicago that said that IB students come in feeling more confident and feeling more well prepared to succeed in terms of being able to manage their time, in terms of their writing and their mathematics preparation, and their motivation to succeed. There was a study from Indiana University, Bloomington. This is where they do the surveys of student engagement. HSSE stands for High School Survey of Student Engagement, where they measure how involved are students. And they find that IB students rated higher levels of academic, behavioral, and emotional engagement, much higher than non-IB students. We've seen the same thing at UBC. Every year at UBC, when students come and they join us in September, we give them a survey on their way in, where we ask them a number of different questions. And some of the questions that we ask them are about how prepared do you feel about coming to university? So what you're seeing here are the questions where there was a statistically significant difference between the IB students and the non-IB students in terms of the likelihood of them saying that they felt either good or very good about their skills in all these different areas. Their ability to do research, their ability to write effectively, their math skills. They're coming in on day one feeling more prepared. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sure, they feel more prepared on day one, but do they still feel more prepared after that first midterm? After that first time that they realize they're not going to get the grades in university that they got in high school? So we surveyed them again, and we found that at the end of the first semester, the IB students still felt confident in their ability to handle university workload. This is the raw data, but I'll tell you one thing. If you wanted the anecdotal data, talk to any IB student in first year university, and my guess is they'll tell you the same thing. For those of us who didn't do the IB, you remember that transition to university for the parents out there. It was, first year can be a little rough. It's a little bit of a rude awakening. It's a little bit of an adjustment going from high school to university. For IB students, sort of more of the same. Most IB students will tell you that first year was just a continuation of high school. They felt quite comfortable. There was no adjustment required. That helps them with their grades, and doing well in university opens up all sorts of doors, not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of getting your major, getting placements in co-op and exchange, graduate programs, professional schools. That's what you get from doing well in university. And that, again, is why we really want to stress that the IB is a strong preparation for university, and that's more important than whether or not you get in. Lastly, IB students are more engaged. We also survey them and say, what kinds of things did you do in first year? So at the end of first year, IB students are more likely to tell us that they got involved in a conference. They got more involved in student government. They're the ones who are getting involved on campus. In any university, these are the kinds of students that we're after, and we see it in what the IB students tell us at the end of first year. Again, this is the data. This is the dry, raw numbers. But I can offer you an anecdotal perspective that is much more colorful. In 2012, I had the opportunity to chair the IB World Student Conference at UBC. We invited about 300 IB students from all over the world to come and spend a week with us in the summer, where we provided them with a variety of different learning opportunities in everything from sustainability to economics to different cultural traditions, all sorts of different workshops. And the thing that I was the most struck with these IB students is it didn't matter what you put in front of them. In a couple of minutes, they were totally into it. Whether it was economics and the financial cost-benefit analysis of putting solar panels on the roof of your house, or Venezuelan folk songs, it didn't matter what they were presented with. They were into it in a very short period of time. That, to me, evidenced the creativity, the critical thinking, the love of learning that the IB tries to instill in students. And it came out in so many different ways. Honestly, I can remember a couple of presentations at this conference where I was sitting in the room going, ooh, I don't think this speaker is going to hold their attention. He or she is talking way over their heads or talking about stuff they're probably not interested in. The second the speaker asked if there were any questions, half the room, their hands shot up. This is a group of students that, for whatever reason, chicken or egg, I don't know, but they are naturally inquisitive, they're naturally creative, and they're into it in terms of their education. So all of these things are very positive characteristics of IB students. Of course, I haven't answered the big question. I haven't resolved my dilemma. I've got 3 students. I've got a 29 IB, I've got a 91% average student from an Ontario high school, and I have a British student with 2 A's and a B. How do I choose which student gets the last seat in my program? The way I do it is by doing what we do at universities, which is we do research, we do data analysis, and we try and create some knowledge with which we can use for practical application. So this is how we do it. Imagine that I had a graph. And on this graph, on one axis, I put all the admission averages of a particular group of students, in this case, BC high school students. And then on the other axis, I put your first year average. And I put a dot for all the different students in terms of what they showed us from high school and how they did in university. And this isn't proportional. So some of these dots may be 1 student, some of these dots may be 100 students. I can create a line that predicts, if I know your high school average, I can make an educated guess on your university average. And again, for the statisticians and social scientists and mathematicians in the room, I can create a formula that I can take your high school average and use it to predict your first year sessional average at UBC. And I can control for things. I can compare just the commerce students. I can control for the amount of courses that you took. I can control for whether or not you took a first year English class or a first year math class. I can do the same thing for IB students. I can plot them all based on their final IB diploma grades. And remember, the IB diploma out of 45, these are final grades. And I can draw a line and I can come up with a formula. And I can predict with some degree of reliability how you'll do in first year. The interesting thing is that if you look at both of these graphs, you'll realize that both of those graphs have one thing in common. They have the same axis on first year performance. So imagine that I do the following. I take the anticipated IB diploma grades, and I've got my line of best fit. and I take the BC high school averages, and I've got my line of best fit. And let's say that I've got a student with a 29 on their IB, and they're predicted to achieve a 70% average at UBC. And let's say on that line, a student with an 86% average, an A student from the BC high school system, is also predicted to achieve a 70% average at UBC. I can flip the one axis and come up with an equivalency in terms of first-year performance. So this isn't me just balancing numbers. This is an equivalency based on how they do in university. And when you look at this line in context, what it tells you is this. An IB student with an anticipated score on their 6 courses between 27 and 30 is predicted to perform in university at the same level as a straight A student, an 86% average out of the high school system. So what this tells me is that even though the vast majority of IB students have grades that are much higher than that, down at a 27 to 30, that's the cutoff line equal to being a straight A student in high school. The majority from 27 to 30 to the right, that whole group is the equivalent of a straight A student in an Ontario high school. And as you can tell, that's almost the entirety of the IB diploma candidates. So what I'm getting from this is that the majority of IB students will perform at the level of a straight A student. And if I've got to make a decision on that last seat, I can now fairly compare an IB student to a regular high school student to the student from the UK, from a French back, from a US high school, because we do the same technique with all the different curricula, be it Ontario, be it US, be it IB. This is how we determine equivalencies. So again, this is telling me that the IB students are strong. And I know that when there's a concern to say, well, you know, you can, if you get a score of 30 on the IB, well, that's not very high. That's quite far from the maximum score of 45. Absolutely, a 30 is very far from the maximum score of 45. But a student with a 30 is still going to perform like a straight A student from high school in university, which speaks to the fact that this is a very stringent grading scale. And universities need to take this into consideration when they make their admission decisions. You saw on the previous slide that I mentioned that we have cutoffs for both the anticipated grades without the core and final grades where we do include those last 3 points. Why do we do things? Why are we concerned about whether or not those 3 additional points for the core are included? For a couple of reasons. One is, in the interest of fairness, as you can see from this slide, while the majority of schools in Canada report the 3 anticipated points for the extended essay, theory of knowledge, and creativity, action, and service, the majority of schools outside of Canada do not. And we don't know why, but they don't. So when we get their grades, we can't tell the difference between a student who has a 0 on their 3 additional points or a student that the school just simply didn't report it. As a result, to be fair, we have recalibrated our admission decisions so that when we look at the anticipated scores, we do it without the 3 additional points, but we do consider them when we get your final IB grades. Now, we value tremendously the core of the IB. The extended essay, the TOK, the CAS, these are big deals to us. The extended essay in particular, there's a great study out of the University of Virginia that correlates performance in university to the extended essay because it teaches students at a very young age to do long-form research. We would love to use it in the admission decision, but it's so inconsistent in the way it's transcribed that we don't. But we will use it on the final scores. There's always a lot of questions about higher level, standard level, and first year credit. UBC does give first year credit for high grades in all higher level courses and in some standard level courses. There's a brochure that we've got tonight that we've been circulating. You can see the scores that you need in order to get first year credit. We give some credit at the standard level, and we give some credit for the theory of knowledge. We've also done some studies and realized that if I had 2 IB students with the exact same IB diploma going into the exact same program at UBC with the exact same grades and taking the exact same course load, if one of those IB students had math HL and the other student had math standard level, the HL student will always do better. So we give a little bit of extra credit in the admission decision if students take higher level math and higher level English. We've seen the same thing with English. Now, does that mean that you need to take those courses in order to get into UBC? Absolutely not. I'm just saying that when we see a student who's taken those courses, all things being considered equal, that student will likely do better at UBC. So we recognize that in the admission decision. Now, IB students are always concerned. I qualify for first year credit, but should I take the credit? Should I do second year courses in first year, or should I just do my first year courses over again? Many universities will let the student decide. Some universities do force the IB student with credit to take the second year class, or prevent them from repeating the first year class. So that's an important question to ask when you're looking at different universities. If I get credit for my IB, will you force me to take the credit and prevent me from repeating the class, or will you allow me to repeat it? At UBC, we let the student do whichever you prefer. And what we find is, when we look at IB students who qualified for first year credit, so these are just the ones that got high enough scores to get first year credit, and we compare them on the number of second year or higher courses that they took. They took 1 upper level course, 2, 3, 4, 5 upper level courses, and see how did those students do. You'll see that the students who go right into the second year courses, their first year sessional averages are none the worse for the fact that they took a more challenging first year. So what this tells me is, it's up to you. If you want to repeat the IB class, the first year class, go ahead. If you want to take the credit and go into second year, you should do just fine. One thing to bear in mind here, our general advice to students is, if you've got first year credit based on IB and you can take the second year class, if it's in your major, probably a good idea to take the first year class anyway. So if you've got first year credit in physics, but you're going to major in physics in university, I would take the first year physics again. But if you've got first year credit for history and you're going to major in physics, I would just take the credit, and if you want to take upper level classes, go right ahead. It really does depend on whether or not it's in your area of specialization. So in terms of our conclusions, IB students tend to be very strong, academically strong, highly engaged first-year students. The diploma is a very consistent and reliable predictor of first-year success. If I go back to those R-squareds, I can tell you that of all the different curricula that pass our desk at UBC in the admissions office in terms of predicting how a student will do, the IB diploma final grades from students in North America are the single best predictor of how a student will do. The vast majority of students perform in first year at the same level as an A to A- student in the regular high school system. And we will take that into consideration when we make the admission decision. Even though sometimes there is a little over-anticipation on the anticipated grades, they are still very reliable. And IB students can transfer first year credit feeling comfortable that if they want to go right into the second year classes, they will do just fine. All this research has taken us about 10 years. In many of these studies, we've done them 3 times. So we did the analysis led to some conclusions. We changed our policies based on those conclusions. We did the analysis again and again. 3 times over the past decade, the conclusions have consistently been the same in terms of the performance. So we're very comfortable using this information and these data in our admission practices. That being said, before we go into questions, I'd like to leave you with one thought. And that one thought is this. I don't want you to think that by saying this, I'm saying, or UBC is saying, that IB is the best curriculum and that all students should do the IB, and that we give an undue advantage to IB students. Our research tells us over and over again, a good student is a good student is a good student. A student who is at the top of their class, whether it's an IB class, an Ontario high school class, A-levels, US, if you're at the top of your class, odds are you will come to university and you will do just fine and you will succeed. So you don't need the IB or you don't need anything to be a great student. But there's no doubt in my mind from these data that although you don't need the IB to be a great student, IB students more often than not and quite consistently are great students. So just keep that in mind that this is not necessarily the only way to succeed, but it's a great way to succeed. And that's my presentation. I would be very happy to take questions if you have them. Thank you. And let me remind you, chocolates. Chocolates, if you see Anthony and Hillary are gearing up with chocolates here. Any questions? Yes. The question was, how do those numbers hold up to the end of 4th year? We've done the studies and the correlations up until 2nd year, and they hold strong. They get a little weaker by 3rd and 4th year because so many things have happened since the IB diploma. So I want to be cautious here. That's not to say that IB students don't do as well in 3rd and 4th year. It's just the relationship between high school grades and university performance gets weaker the more time that passes. But certainly everything that you saw there in 1st year holds straight into 2nd year, and then it begins to taper off because so much other stuff has happened. There was another question over here. So the question is, have there been any studies of students in terms of their, IB students in terms of their performance post-undergraduate? We haven't. Again, for the same reasons that I would argue that if a student got into the most amazing graduate program in the world, it's probably the result of their undergrad as opposed to their IB. But again, there's a chicken and an egg, because if the best students are attracted to the IB, then the best students are more likely to be IB students who will do well in university, who will get those kinds of graduate outcomes. Some of the studies that I referred to, particularly that one study in the UK, did find that IB students have better than average post-grad outcomes, getting into master's and PhD programs, getting into professional school. But they don't correlate it with the IB diploma grades. The focus on the IB diploma grades tends to be much more about admission into baccalaureate study. The question is there any correlation between gender and country of origin? We haven't done any of these data analyses looking at gender, but we have seen that there are differences based on geographic location. You'll see that a lot of the IB data that I put up, I was being very specific in stating North American IB. IB students from different parts of the world will perform differently at UBC than a student from Canada or the States with the same IB score. So it does vary a little bit from different points in the world. Even though the IB goes to great lengths to be consistent internationally in its marking, there are still some variations. Personally, I think a lot of that variation has to do with the human factor. 2 IB students, one from Toronto, one from Singapore with the same IB grades, the student from Singapore may perform differently than the student from Toronto, but that may have more to do with cultural adjustment, homesickness, those kinds of things than their academic preparation. But to answer your question, yes, we see variation by the location of the secondary school. We haven't studied anything in terms of gender. The question is, have we broken this down by faculty or department? We have, and we see the results are relatively consistent amongst the different faculties and departments. But I will say if I had to pick one area where the IB is an even stronger predictor than what you saw on the screen, it would be engineering. It's a really, really good predictor for engineers. Now, that might be because in our admission requirements, we force students going into engineering to take math, chem, and physics. So we're forcing them to take more sciences. But certainly the IB has a particularly strong correlation for students going into engineering. That's a good question. Anthony, she needs 2 chocolates on that one. 2 chocolates on that one. The question was, is it safe to assume that all universities across Canada are using this information? I can tell you that this information has been shared with universities all across Canada. I was here a couple of years ago and shared this at an admissions forum for all the Ontario universities. They have the equivalencies. They've seen the studies that UBC has done. I know that the U of T is very interested in replicating our study with their students. So they're very aware. And particularly with the University of Toronto, I can tell you from speaking with my colleagues there, they're quite aware of the strength of the IB diploma. I can't guarantee you that they're using the exact same scales that we are, but I can guarantee you that they're aware of it and they know the strength of the IB students. I guess what I would say is that whether it's IB or whether it's Alberta, whether it's Germany, whether it's the US, whether it's AP, I think all universities have to at least put some effort in trying to make sure that they're being fair. It's hard. It's really hard to say, yes, I'm treating everybody fairly, even though I'm not treating them equally. So to answer your question, I don't know if they will do this. I don't know if they will come and give the same talk. I would say that they probably don't need to, as long as they do the research and do their best to maintain that level of fairness. Again, there's a lot of IB in Canada. If you go back to that one slide, you know, we're the second largest IB country in the world, high proportion of diplomas. A lot of the universities in Canada are very familiar with the IB. My sense is that it's more the universities outside of Canada that are a little less familiar with the IB than the universities inside of Canada. That's anecdotal. I have nothing to back that up. That's just my sense. Yes?
What does IB stand for?
Oh, I'm sorry?
What does IB stand for?
IB stands for International Baccalaureate.
Give him a chocolate.
You need a chocolate for that one. Yeah, someone's got to get a chocolate for that. Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Assuming that you have an IB diploma.
So just so I'm clear, the question is, if you're a top IB student, and certainly in my mind, somebody with a 40 would be a very strong IB student, whether you should attend a top university in Canada versus a top university in the United States or in the UK.
Given the additional cost.
It's very, very difficult to quantify the value of going to an elite post-secondary school. So I don't feel comfortable saying, you know, this Ivy League school in the United States would be worth it. This Russell Group school in the UK would be worth it. I think that's a very personal decision. I think that varies based on the program of study that you're going into. For program X, it might be totally worthwhile. For program Y, it wouldn't. I will say that we are fortunate in Canada to have a lot of great universities with excellent international reputations, and if you're a Canadian citizen or who can qualify for domestic tuition rates, it's an absolute bargain. Schools like UBC, the University of Toronto, McGill, the only reason our tuition looks inexpensive in comparison to a lot of the top 40 schools in the world, it's because it's subsidized by your tax dollars. If we were charging the full cost of the education like many of those other schools do, our price tags would be just as big as theirs. The only reason we look inexpensive is because we're subsidized by the government. So I can't say. I think that's a very personal decision. I knew that there is research out there that does studies comparing students who were admitted to top universities and went, and who were admitted to elite universities and didn't go, and to see 5-10 years later what the outcomes are. And in many cases what they find, generally speaking, is the outcomes are the same unless you come from a lower socioeconomic background. That going to an elite school for somebody from a lower socioeconomic background can sort of buoy you up much, much more than anybody else. But that's not my opinion. There's research out there, and I would take a look at it that tries to quantify the value of those institutions. Very, very difficult question to answer. Yes, absolutely. No, it's a good question, and so the question is that if we say that an IB student at a 27 performs at the same level as an Ontario high school student from an 86, there's a lot more range after 27 than there is after 86. Is that high end getting compressed? This falls to that comment that I made before. At the end of the day, is a good student is a good student is a good student. Once you're getting to the point that you're comparing a 98% student with a 38 on the IB, I mean, it's very hard to distinguish students at that level when they're just so exceptional. From the point of view of admissions, we would say it doesn't matter, because you either get in or you don't. I can't admit you more with a higher grade. As long as with your 27 or your 30 or your 33, you got into the program you wanted to get into, that's sort of where we draw the line.
Well, I guess the chronology.
Absolutely. And for those who didn't hear, so the point is that if you're looking at an elite school with extremely high cutoffs, or a small program where their intake is very small and the cutoffs are high, yes, you may get into situations where it's difficult to tell the difference between a 38 and a 98, and the 38 student on the IB could have gotten a 99 if they'd been in the regular stream. My sense is that most schools, that when they get that competitive, they begin to look at things other than grades. So your likelihood of getting into Oxbridge, where you would need absolutely sky-high grades from the Ontario high school system or from the IB, they're going to look at more than just grades to make that decision, because it's getting so fine-tuned at that very high end. The question is, what percentage of IB students get scholarships? I don't have that information for UBC because we do, our scholarships are viewed on more than just grades. They're viewed on things such as the personal profile and the kinds of information that you provide about yourself. So I don't have a number off the top of my head on the proportion of IB students who get scholarship, or the proportion of scholarship winners who are IB students. It's more than just the credential at that point. But certainly I think for most universities around the world, they will tell you that a lot of the IB students tend to be their strongest students. And so they would certainly be qualifying for scholarship if the university has a lot of scholarship. There were some more questions. Yes? So the question is, if I had two IB students, one who has performed more, done more extracurricular been more involved outside of the class. At UBC, that would matter because we look at personal profiles as part of your application process. We're going to ask all our applicants, IB or not, to answer 5 to 7 short answer questions where you tell us a little bit about yourself and the kinds of things you've done outside of the classroom, and most importantly, what you've learned from those experiences. If you've done a lot, then you're going to have more to answer on that section and increase your chances of getting in. The CAS portion of the IB diploma, in many senses, is like a preparation for UBC's personal profile because it asks students to get involved and then to reflect back on what you learned from the things that you did. It prepares you. Is it necessary in terms of your CAS score? No, but it will make you have a better personal profile at UBC. Now, not all universities look at personal profiles. Some admit you on straight grades. But again, I would go back to that larger concept, and that is whether or not your extracurricular involvement gets you into university, doing those kinds of things will help you succeed when you're in university. And that's the most important thing, because that's where your chances of getting the major that you want, the program that you want, the co-op that you want, the international exchange, the grad program, that's where those decisions are made. So to answer your question in a very long-winded way, yes, it can matter. Not always for every institution, but it always has a benefit in the long run in terms of how you do. The question is, would I look at the types of activities performed? To some extent, but I'm equally interested in what you did and what you learned from it. So to give you an example, if you said, I've been involved for 5 years playing hockey, and someone else said, I've been involved for 5 years playing hockey and I'm on the Olympic team. Obviously, the fact that you're playing on the Olympic team at a higher level, that'll have a positive impact. But by the same token, someone might say, I play hockey and I don't play at the elite level, but if that person can articulate what they've learned from their experiences playing hockey, what they've learned about teamwork, what they've learned about communication within a group, that student can still get a really high personal profile score even though they're not on the Olympic team. So yes, we look at what you do and we qualify what you do, but you don't have to do extraordinary things to have a strong profile. You need to have learned something and be able to articulate what you've learned from those experiences to have a strong profile. Again, for UBC, it varies from program to program how much emphasis is placed on the personal profile. And again, some universities admit on straight grades. It's important that you check with the university to see what they're looking at. My sense is that business programs and engineering programs in particular are going more and more to looking at things beyond grades in order to get in. And then as soon as you start looking at US schools, then it's totally wide open in terms of interviews, personal profiles, essays, extracurriculars, letters of recommendation, all that kind of thing. Well, I guess the first thing, the question is about whether you should apply as an IB student or as a regular high school student. Actually, in most cases, you can't choose which one. If you complete the diploma, we're going to get the diploma and we'll treat you like a diploma student. If you are in the regular high school stream, we'll get your high school courses and we'll go from there. If you've got some IB courses, we will use them as part of your complete Ontario high school diploma, but we will evaluate you as an Ontario high school student, not as an IB student. I guess my response to your question about which way to go, I would say, again, for UBC, having done this research, even if you didn't do as well on the diploma as you would like, we're fully aware that students who don't have the highest grades on the IB diploma still do well in university, and so we take that into consideration. I can't speak to, again, to every university in Canada, but this information is being shared, and so hopefully they would take that into consideration. Again, if a student was thinking about dropping the IB diploma because they want to get higher grades in the regular high school stream, I would again go back to that point. I think it's more important to make sure you do well in university than it is, I think you should be focusing more on that than getting in, because we have so many different strong options of places to study in Canada. I knew that if I kept taking questions long enough, AP would eventually come up. And the question is it more advantageous to take AP courses even as an IB student? For UBC, I would say no. We're going to look at your IB diploma. If you've got the IB diploma plus 1 AP, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4, we're not going to factor that in. We're just going to look at the IB diploma. Now, if you're an Ontario high school student taking AP classes, we will certainly look at the AP, and we will consider that as part of the decision. But if what you're asking me is, as an IB student, should I also take APs? If you're doing the full diploma, we're going to look at the full diploma. If you're just doing certificates on the IB, we're going to mix and match with the IB, the AP, and your regular high school to come up with a profile. But all these equivalencies that I've been sharing for the past little while are based on full IB diploma scores. If a student had AP on top of that, it wouldn't factor into the admission decision. It may factor into first year credit. You may get more first year credit, but it's not going to help your chances of getting in, at least at UBC. My sense is that in many universities in Canada, if the student is presenting the IB diploma, that's what the school looks at. More can't be worse, but it's not always better. How about this? We'll do one more question because it's getting late and I think some folks might want to go. But we will stick around and I will stick around and answer any of your questions individually. So please don't feel that I'm depriving you of an opportunity for a chocolate, because I'm really not. We'll go right at the very back. We don't pull apart the diploma or look at the individual courses with two exceptions. One, some programs will have certain prerequisites. So logically, that's a given. So that's number one. Number two, if we see higher level English or higher level math, we give the student a little bit of a bump because we know that student will do better in first year. After that, we're not pulling apart the IB diploma. So whether you've got a course in Spanish or in French, we're not fussed. If you've got a course in film studies or in European history, we're not making judgments based on that. We look at the overall IB diploma score. We look at to make sure that you've got certain prerequisites. We look to make sure that you've done moderately well in those prerequisites. And then sometimes we give a bump on the English and the math, but that's about it. I wouldn't encourage a student to do more than 3 HLs. At the end of the day, the only reason that you would do more than 3 HLs would be to get more first year credit. And I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, if there's any IB coordinators or educators in the audience, I'd be curious as to your take as to whether or not it's recommended to keep going with more higher levels. From a university perspective, it's not going to sway in the admission decision. It's not going to create sway in the admission decision. I don't think, and I'll turn to some of my colleagues to correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that higher level math is required for engineering, so it's not a prereq. But certainly if I had 2 students with the same IB grades in the same courses, both going into engineering, and one had higher level math, actually for this matter, going into arts, going into sciences, going into anything. 2 students, they look the same, but one's got the higher level math, it'll sway a little bit to their advantage. Now, to be fair, let's look at this practically. If I had 2 students and they both had IB diploma scores of 37, they're both getting in, whether or not they've got the higher level math. So this is only an issue if you are close to the cutoff line. It's only an issue in that dilemma that I described when I've only got 1 seat left. My sense is that most students who are taking things like higher level math, in many cases, they're well above our cutoffs. So it's not really an issue. That would give you a little bump, but again, it would only be relevant if you were on the line. If you were well above the line, that bump is a nice bump, but it didn't make or break your admission decision. You're welcome. And again, we'll stick around and we will answer all questions. So if you do have more, please just come up to the front, and happy to answer any and all questions.
On behalf of IB Schools of Ontario and Upper Canada College, I wanted to thank Andrew for his informative and affirming presentation on the value of the IB diploma, and please accept a token of our appreciation.
Terrific. Thank you
Thanks.
so much. That's great. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much. Wonderful.